Wonderful. Rupi, welcome to the Depth Work podcast. I'm so glad we get to chat.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to learn more about your life history, your work history. So I was curious if you could just start us off by telling us a little bit about how you got into the field as a child psychiatrist, and if you have any kind of personal connections to the field as well.
You got it. So my name is Rupi Legha. I am many things. I am a dog mom to two naughty little dachshunds who frequently make guest appearances during my clinical sessions, which people love. I'm a daughter to Sewa and Kuldeep, who are Punjabi Sikh and immigrated to this country decades ago. Let's see, I'm a very proud auntie to a treasured nibbling. I try to be a good friend and neighbor and good citizen of the world. And in addition to that, I am also a psychiatrist. I'm board certified in child psychiatry, also in adult psychiatry. And I had some sustained experience doing a fellowship in global mental health, primarily in rural Haiti, but also in Peru. That was for about 3 years. And my life right now is a clinical practice that I run that is person-centered, holistic, humane, affirming, anti-racist. I think we can call it so many things, but it is what it is, and then it also is what it is not in relation to traditional models. I also do a lot of writing. I publish in different scholarly journals, and I do that because I feel like that can move the needle a bit when it comes to mental health training and professionalization. Do some speaking, created an anti-racism fellowship. And then the last thing is that I've recently started doing some legislative work related to mental health equity. And so, yeah, these are all of the personal and professional tools in my toolkit that position me to try to make some good changes and improvements in mental health care.
That's a great many hats that you wear. Yeah, as a lot of us do. But I'm curious if there was anything specific that made you curious about mental health or psychiatry. How did you decide to go into the field?
Yeah, I think that's, multi-layered. And I'll preface by saying, one gets asked this question a lot. And certainly when I was in training, which I was in from 2009 to 2018, when you're applying for different programs, you give sort of your recitation of why you're in the profession. And that experience was formative in terms of me learning what to say and what not to say. And the thing
Mhm.
that I would not say that I wished to say was my own lived experience. And over 20 years ago, I experienced the mental health crisis system firsthand. And that's something that as a doctor and a psychiatrist, you're taught to be ashamed of and to hide from people. You're taught that it's pathological evidence of potential impairment and unprofessionalism. And so it's really only in the last year or so that I've found the courage to speak openly about it. There was a time closer to 20 years ago when I did speak openly about it because that felt like the healthiest, most authentic thing to do. I learned from within the profession that that would be incredibly harmful to me to continue to do that. And so I was taught to protect myself by keeping that really formative chapter of my life to myself and not exposing it to my colleagues who might be prone to weaponizing it against me.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that hardcore. That's also something that I experienced when I worked in the public mental health system. You're really taught that disclosure is not okay, and the weaponization of it is so common. But I imagine that your own lived experience really helps you understand the people that you're aiming to support in a much greater way. And specifically, I'm curious what you've kind of learned, or maybe I guess I should say unlearned, from your clinical training in the process of working with many clients over the years.
Yeah, no, I'm so sorry that you went through that as well. I think those of us who have experienced it, will say that, and then there's nobody to say, I'm so sorry, that shouldn't have happened. You deserved better. And yeah, I think obviously I know you know that, but I think it's important to say. So I think, I did 9 years of postgraduate training after medical school. Most psychiatrists do four, usually maybe five, or possibly six, but nine is quite a lot. So I was really, immersed in the model that they give us, and you're taught that there's an evidence-based way of practicing and that these are the standards that you're held to legally. and ethically, and they're sort of put forward as universally healing and humane. There's little to no cultivation of critical consciousness or critique that's brought into psychiatry training. And, in order to survive it and succeed in it and actually complete the training and the accreditations, you really have to buy into the model. Otherwise, you will not make it. You will be labeled deficient, unprofessional, maybe even accused of misconduct. And so I had 9 years of navigating that. But I think what was really formally missing, but very much operating within me internally, was the experience that I had had personally, which, I think really my heart went out to people who are experiencing similar things, because I had some sense of just how dizzying, confusing, alienating mental health care, whether it's insurance parity, whether it's having to pay out of pocket for things, whether, it's the way in which you are judged if you show up 3 minutes late for an appointment or go 2 minutes over. There was so much of that left me feeling like I was doing everything wrong. And so when I was in training, learning how to provide care, I think, when I would interact with parents, I could see my own parents and what their experience was like and how terrifying it was for them when I went through what I went through. And, when I was in emergency rooms with young people and could see them like just completely overstimulated by the settings, terrified of what they were seeing, and just, wanting to comfort them and protect them and even get them out of those settings. So it really was foundational for me to bring that perspective in. And then I think it influenced a lot in terms of how I practiced. Like I said, you really have to conform to the model to get through it. If you don't, you will not make it. And so I'm sad to say that to some extent I did have to do that. But, then there was a way in which one would have opportunities to bring humanity into all the things that you were doing. And honestly, because I did so much of that, I think my care just went a lot further than a lot of other people's. And, I won so many awards during psychiatry residency training, which I'm grateful for, sure. But, it's kind of laughable that I had sort of a stain on my record and then won so many accolades over those years. And I think it was just because I seemed to demonstrate a model of excellence or proficiency. But what was laughable about it, ironically, was that so much of that derived from the personal experiences that I had.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, a lot of listeners will already be quite critical of psychiatry, those who are listening to this podcast. But I'm curious for you, what were the biggest, like, moral injuries that you faced in your time as a psychiatrist? Like, what were your biggest, what would you say were the ways in which psychiatry really, really needs to shift, that psychiatry can really be damaging to people?
Yeah, I mean, I think right from the start, your first few years of training, you're largely in inpatient or emergency room settings. And right from the start, you are brought into restraining and secluding people physically and chemically. And I mean, I remember being like, you'll do like overnight shifts in hospitals and you'll get paged to come into a setting where the restraints have already been put in place and you sign off on it. And this is standard practice. It's lawful to do this. Nobody is doing anything wrong, so to speak. But I think those first few times when I would show up and sign off on someone being chemically or physically restrained, and it was one thing. It's a thing for anyone, but I experienced that with adults, and then to do it with children, somebody else's children. So violating an adult's own personhood and autonomy, and then to do it to a child and their family. So to just put your John Hancock on something and sign it on the dotted line felt deeply disconcerting to me. And the initiation into that was like showing up, learning the legalities, like the rules of like how often someone needs to be checked, how quickly, there's like a time limit where you have to show up and sign off on it within a certain period of time. So there's an urgency there. But there was no discussion of what it meant to do that to someone. There was no meditation on the inequities shaping that process. This might be a controversial thing to say, but I truly do not think one should be allowed to tie down and restrain someone unless you've physically experienced it yourself. Like you just should not be allowed to do to other people what you would not allow to be done to yourself. So it was just the
Yeah.
framing and the initiation of it. It was just you were thrown into signing off on it and being a part of it. And I could say a similar thing about legal holds, 72-hour holds, certifications, involuntary care. The way in which you're brought into it is like you're taught the mechanics and the logistics of it, and you're just asked to do it. But there's no kind of questioning of what it means to do that to someone.
Yeah. Yeah. And not even an awareness, right, around how those types of practices are so traumatizing and not at all healing, which is when someone's in a crisis, to be tacking on more trauma to someone's experience. It's just, yeah, the opposite of what we should be doing. What are some of your recommendations for maybe younger clinicians or people who are getting into the field who maybe have this feeling or this awareness like something's not quite right, but maybe I want to go into the field to try to make some changes? What would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a different era and generation now. And so I have more hope for these things. But I think the first thing I would say is your questioning and critiquing is everything that is needed for 2025. And if and when it is configured as deficiency, unprofessionalism, ineptitude, I hope by kind of priming people to keep their eyes open for that, it can be more of a collective yawn instead of, internalizing an attack. Like, I think for me, it was really hard to not internalize it as an attack or a reflection of my not being capable. But I'm hopeful that there's a growing consciousness and awakening among the next generation of providers to where, for me, I often felt like I was the only one who felt this way. But I think maybe in programs, there's a better chance of multiple people feeling this way. And when you're rotating, you're going to have colleagues there, and they might be like-minded and like spirited. But I think just to anticipate that the boring usual accusations will come, and they're tired and predictable, and are I mean nothing about how important your critique and consciousness is.
Yeah, organizing with your colleagues. Totally. That's number one. I remember that feeling so well working as a junior social worker in crisis. I was like, am I crazy? Am I the only one experiencing this? But that's by design, right? To kind of isolate you away from people. I'm curious, specifically working with children. I have a few other friends and colleagues who are psychiatrists who work with children, and it is a quite unique situation. Also, in terms of power dynamics, obviously there are power dynamics with adults as well. But I find so I used to work in a different, much better, more humane program, also in the crisis setting. I worked for the Parachute program, uses the open dialogue approach, and so we're bringing the whole family around the person. We're not starting from the place of, the person who's having the crisis is the problem. We're understanding that the problem is across the entire context, family, intergenerational as well. And so it was a wonderful experience. And yet, of course, naturally, power dynamics, especially where the parents often might want to align with the psychiatrist or the psychologist and say, like, you need to give my kids medication, or you need to fix this problem or solve this problem, completely leaving, the child, the person out of the equation and left with very little agency and control, right? So how do you navigate situations like that with parents?
Yeah, so in my own practice, I have a number of people that I see who maybe are like in their 20s or 30s and who had child psychiatric care when they were younger. And so they've shown up in my practice as adults, but they carry the wounds and scars of what happened with child mental health care when they were younger. And, the patterns that they have identified in terms of the lasting impacts of that really shape and inform how I make sense of the kids that I see. But some of the things that the adults will say is that when they were kids and forced to do family meetings, they paid for it afterwards. So I'll consistently hear people say, like, I was forced to do family meetings with my parents, and then after the meeting ended and I went home, I bore the brunt of the fallout from that. So that was
Yeah.
like one huge thing. I definitely have heard from people that diagnoses were made in conjunction with parental and other adult authority figures who were determined to make the child the problem. And a lot of like the healing that we'll do in care as an adult is like me like writing a letter of support saying you do not carry this diagnosis. I see no evidence of it whatsoever. And the medications, that's the other piece that comes up. I mean, I see some people where, you know, they've been on psychotropics for years and they were on psychotropics during formative phases of their neurological development. And, you know, regardless of what I think is happening biologically, physiologically, they feel strongly that being put on the meds has created a dependence on them, and that efforts to like wash out or take themselves off of them have been devastating. And so they really feel like the meds were put on board without their really understanding the long-term effect, and they feel like they are suffering the long-term effects. And so there's a way in which they feel like there was not an informed consent process for this, that it was a decision made without them, and now they're stuck with the consequences. So I think bringing that then to kids who are younger, I see all of those things.
Mhm.
And I think another thing that really comes to mind is interfacing with the juvenile justice system and the ways in which I've seen kids who are part of that system. And then there's a way in which the mental health care feels like it's a part of that system or is very much complicit, you know, even in terms of physically providing care in those settings.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I saw that a lot in my work as well. The school to prison pipeline, but how the mental health system really like is such a big crux of that. And, it leads me to you do a lot of anti-racist work within mental health. And I think there's been a little bit of a shift in terms of, people wanting to get culturally competent training or maybe even some structural competency training, right? But I think it's really rare that we have the spaces to develop an understanding that psychiatry is inherently racist, historically racist on every level, and doing some, cultural competency is not going to fix that structure. So, can you tell us, maybe for those that aren't as aware, how psychiatry really enforces racist values?
Oh, yes. There are so many things that I can think of in response to that. And I want to say, these really important questions that you're asking, it can be tough for me to like kind of bullet them in my head. Why? Because there are no competencies or requirements for me in this domain. And so it's been a free for all. So some of the things that come to mind, a couple of years ago, around the time that the 1619 project came out, before that, I developed some material related to the legacy of slavery in American medicine and psychiatry. And, just wanted the word slavery to be said out loud in health professional settings as it pertains to contemporary health and mental health inequities and different arcs of oppression that endure from past to present. So, some of the things that we would talk about in that workshop related to like a legacy of forced medical experimentation. And so, people know about Tuskegee, but it's Tuskegee and so much more than that. So whether it's grave robbing in the 19th century, Tuskegee in the 20th century, the fenfluramine study in the 1990s with, major New York medical institutions examining aggression and violence in kids and being fixated on that topic. Aggression and violence in Black and brown kids, not the aggression that Black and brown kids are enduring as a result of state and other forms of violence. There's a legacy of professional exclusion where, white cis heteronormative models of competency and capability have been the norm for doctors, psychiatrists, and other healthcare providers, and everyone else is, actively and avidly blocked or kept out. And we see that in, the demographics of who and what our mental health workforce, is. Even the fact that those of us who have been disabled by mental health challenges or other challenges face huge hurdles and stumbling blocks to participating in the workforce today. Another big one that comes up is like upholding racism and other systems of oppression by focusing, blaming, and judging individuals and obsessing over their behavior. And, drapetomania from slavery, a term created by Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a renowned physician and psychiatrist. And the idea behind that was that enslaved individuals who ran away were pathological. They had a disorder called drapetomania, and the treatment was punishment, or whipping or things of that nature. And then we can see that showing up in different behavioral and conduct disorders today. Oppositional defiant disorder, which is overdiagnosed in Hispanic, Black, and American Indian and Alaska Native kids, and the behavioral control intervention. So those are just a number of the different arcs and themes that come up, and just want to emphasize that providers are not required to know about any of those things, and therefore they're not held accountable to do anything to protect people against that ongoing harm.
Yeah. And this is the research and the practice that psychiatry was literally built upon. And there are some people who can say, yeah, but it's not like that anymore. Well, we can talk about some very real things that happen currently in the mental health system. For example, I'm so glad that you wrote that article on oppositional defiant disorder, where you described how ODD diagnoses are 30%, 35% more prevalent in Black people than white people. But even more alarming is that Black children are 73% more likely to get diagnosed with any type of conduct disorder, specifically Black adolescents compared with white youth. And this is something that I 100% have seen in my time as a junior social worker. Like working in crisis, most of the young white boys that I would see were diagnosed with ADD. And what's the outcome of an ADD diagnosis? We get more time on tests. We get a paraprofessional to come into the school. We get all these, wraparound kinds of support. ADD has functionally pretty much the same types of behavioral patterns, the same types of symptoms or things that we witness. But an ODD diagnosis absolutely, I think, as you say directly in your paper, greases the school to prison pipeline, because ODD is a diagnosis that is seen, someone is perceived as much more violent, erratic, perhaps even dangerous. And once again, the focus is on the individual. We're not at all trying to look at why is this person, really struggling or suffering. I remember a client that I had in the system whose family was pushed to the outskirts of New York City, living in public housing in poverty. This young boy was facing gang violence every single day on his way home from school, was absolutely terrified from facing this violence every day, and was hiding knives under his bed. And the job of my team was to come in and pathologize that behavior and say, whoa, this person is hiding knives under their bed. Maybe they have paranoid schizophrenia. Maybe they have ODD, all these things. And no one was asking the question, why is this person doing this? This is a very rational behavior for someone who's experiencing, systemic violence on a day-to-day basis. So anyways, I just wanted to say that I'm very glad that you wrote that paper. And yeah, can you tell us a bit more about ODD and the racism in it and through it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think what I began to notice from the time that I was in fellowship, child psychiatry fellowship training and beyond is, I would see so many primarily Black children, but also brown children who would show up and have an ODD label there. And I can think of so many of those kids who came into clinical settings, many of whom were in the foster care system or justice involved. And the way that they would show up in these clinics was just like so shut down. And it was so clear that there was no faith in my being there to help them. I was just part of, I was just any other teacher, principal, probation officer, foster parent even, who just thought they were inherently bad and was there to punish them. And I think it was just to like viscerally connecting to that and just really sensing like, oh my gosh, this child has been attacked and degraded and put down and is even afraid of me. In emergency room settings, for sure, there was a pattern of seeing Black children in particular who would come in restrained. And if you looked at their records in the emergency room, it was like a pattern of like coming in from a group home or foster care setting because they were being threatening or violent or whatever else, and then coming in restrained. Maybe they've already been injected, then they would get injected again, and then they would be so sleepy and sedated or shut down that they would be allowed to go back to the group home setting. So just seeing these viscerally jarring scenarios play out over and over again. I think also like seeing school reports where maybe even if the kid hadn't quite gotten an ODD diagnosis, they were labeled as oppositional or defiant. And, sometimes seeing school paperwork where, I mean, there were just, would I call them errors or blatant lies about kids, feeding into like all of these racialized tropes about having, a cocaine addicted parent when that was not the case at all. Or I would often see that huge chunks of the kid's life were missing. Like, I had one young person where they had watched a parent die in front of them while trying to resuscitate them in grade school. And that wasn't in the school records in terms of, understanding the child or making sense of them. So just seeing these patterns over and over again of these children, being vilified and attacked, and then sort of sitting with the evidence-informed toolkit where I was supposed to, parent train or disciplinary behaviors or incentivize good behaviors or medicate certain things. And what I saw before me was just a child who had been worn down and attacked and was yelling for protection and care and concern. That was sort of how it showed up for me.
Absolutely. What would you say is most needed in psychiatry right now for people to gain some anti-racist skills?
Yeah, I think really just this idea of protecting people. As a psychiatrist, you are a doctor, you have a medical degree. For all the things I disagree with, there's great privilege and power in that position. I'm not saying it should be there, but the fact is that it is. And then how do you leverage that to protect people? And so, yeah, I mean, I think really this idea of being a protector and a nurturer and a carer, a caregiver of people, and leveraging the great privilege and power that has been placed in your hands. For me, that's the guiding ethos of everything that I try to do in a non-patronizing way. But I that's not something that is talked about in our training or professionalization at all.
What about in terms of like really pushing back against the system? Because I think psychiatrists are kind of seen as like the top of the totem pole, like maybe they're not the funders of these programs, right? But there's a certain level of power. What do you think is within people's kind of capacity to do to really push back against these systems?
So, I think this is where a lot of people find themselves, and I'm stating my own complicity here. Like, you kind of come out of medical school. A lot of people have six figures in debt, maybe from undergrad and from med school itself. You come out of residency where for the number of hours you're making, you're not making much money. And so, the debt kind of picks up. And then the jobs that are available to you coming right out of training involve working in emergency rooms or inpatient settings. And I remember I worked in those jobs. Like those jobs are lucrative. You will earn money so that you can get a down payment on a house or pay back your loans or care for your family, whatever it is. And, for me, my evolution and the privilege that allowed me to do this was completely breaking from those institutions and entities. So at some point, I just was no longer able to work in an emergency room or inpatient setting because I just vowed to myself that I could never restrain somebody again. And so I think really refusing to participate and work in these institutions. And I mean, it's only collectively when we refuse to do them that they're going to start to shift and change. I mean, seclusion and restraint happens under a doctor's order. So yeah, I think refusing to participate in these practices is a huge one. And then I think the secondarily, like the need to have like reinvigorated and reawakened 2025 or 2035 and 3025 clinical standards that are elevating our practice. I mean, just the same old tired things that we're doing for people day after day that do nothing and often make things worse. I think that's where the ODD paper comes in. That's where other anti-racism papers that I've written come in. And, of course, like much of what I write about is very oriented around racially minoritized people because so many medical practices are racialized. But of course, anti-racist care must be affirming care, must be liberating care. And, it serves any and all people that it's delivered to.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's so true. And I also had a similar trajectory of going into private practice because I was like, I cannot work inside of these systems. Not only is it completely unsustainable, the moral injury is too great, and you start to feel like you're harming people more than helping them. But to your point too, I feel like we need people on both sides, right? We need people who are working outside the system who have a bit more freedom and power to say absolutely no, we are not going to do this anymore. And people who are working in the system and kind of, cross collaborating and doing some movement organizing across fields as well. Now that you're outside of the system, like you said, that gives you some privilege to do this work in a different way. What have you been focusing your energy on now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the luxury and freedom of working for myself is that I don't have to like live in fear that if I say something or, do something that I might get fired from a job or get a bad report or something like that. And so, in my clinical practice, it's just given me the space to practice at a really, what I aspire to be like a really high, elevated, humane, transformative, cross-generational approach. And so I think to even be able to introduce people to care with that language. So when people reach out and are interested, it's not the stack of paperwork that they're getting. It's kind of an introduction to my way, our way of doing things. So there's that. I think, with the writing and the scholarship that I do, I'm doing it on my own by and large, like in my head, not institutionally affiliated or collaborating as much with other folks most of the time. And so I think that's really emboldened me to try to articulate and say things that I know and the journals are are not always open to, but at least I feel like I'm right with myself and saying what needs to be said and trying to tell the truth of what's actually happening. And then I think, trying to develop teaching programs to support other people with practicing this way. I think for a while, my different chapters, one chapter was me really just trying to figure out what I was doing and how I was doing things differently. And then at some point, I think from conversations with other people, realized that it would be worth passing these things on to other people. I think for a while, I didn't even think that people would be interested in this because there was so much pushback during training about anti-racism. But, over time, I've come to see that other people, other practitioners are really craving this kind of material and it doesn't exist. So yeah, those are some of the big things. And then the other thing I would say is as part of that, like living in my own joy and happiness and health and well-being, I think that part really gets, knocked out. It's not even part of the equation. And it's not, self-care. I wouldn't say it's self-care, but there's something so crucial to me about my own wellness and happiness and self-work that ties to, the clinical and other things that I'm doing that it's not something that I'm doing to other people or with other people. It's me and myself as well.
Yeah, but that also, I imagine, translates to how you are able to show up with people and the energy you're able to put into your creative work and writing and research. Yeah. I'm also curious about your long-term vision for psychiatry. Do you think that long-term psychiatry is kind of broken beyond repair? Do you think that there's something else that you hope kind of fills this spot? Or do you think there's a place for psychiatry that it really can shift and adapt in a humane and transformative way? What do you think?
Yeah, these are such important questions. And I would say that maybe like I have question marks, not so much definitive statements, but question marks. And I think one very important question to ask, which, I know will sound heretical as a psychiatrist, is should this profession exist? And I know other people have asked this question, but I think we
Yeah.
have to look at certain medical specialties, and the ones that kind of jump out are obstetrics and gynecology, surgery, and psychiatry, and they have such deep ties to slavery woven into the DNA of their practices. This really begs the question of, is there more harm than good? We haven't even sorted out a reparations approach to any of these things. We haven't even sat and acknowledged. I mean, there's been a little bit more acknowledgement about the histories of these different professions. I would put psychology in there as well. But, there's been no atonement, repair, accountability, reparations. And so in the absence of that, I think I have less hope about us just continuing and trying to change. It feels like that, looking back, really is the foundation. I think if there's room for that and, a deep and abiding commitment to doing that, I see more hope for reimagining and reinvigorating these things. But, currently it's not happening. I wrote this paper like looking at whiteness and white supremacy in American psychology. No more building resiliency. And, the language that I use in that paper is like there is deep seated white supremacy that is rotting this profession at its core. And I framed that by looking at the response from organized psychology to the January 6th riots and like kind of tracing some of the historical arcs there. But yeah, I mean, how can you not look at these ideas like drapetomania, forced experimentation, eugenics, white supremacy, and statistics, and these things are rotten. They're not just like, blemishes. Like these are really rotten, deadly, genocidal acts that we have to sit with and look at. And I think it's really hard for me to imagine reform or change given just sort of how that history has been deleted and erased. But I think if people can really commit to doing that comprehensively, then I think we have some hope for creating something better.
Yeah, beautiful. I totally agree. And you're also doing work in terms of policy. And thank you for sharing the SHIELD Act with me in California. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, yes, yes. So earlier in 2024, I was blessed to be part of Rise Justice Lab's Changemaker program. And Rise is a nonprofit that was founded by Amanda and and it focuses on writing laws, enacting laws for various issues. Rise is focused on sexual assault survivors laws, and they've passed 90 laws on the state and federal and even, UN resolution level. And they run this accelerator program teaching other people who are invested in different issues how to do the same. So, I came into this not really knowing much of anything about policy legislation, but, psychiatrists play a key role in mental health crisis management. And certainly that's an arena where I really feel the weight of my privilege and power in terms of how I can support people. And, mental health crisis management can be deadly for people, or it can be deeply traumatizing and wounding for people, so much so that they end up having to heal from the trauma of life and then the trauma of the mental health care that just made things worse. And so through Rise, I put together a bill related to mandated training of healthcare providers, where they're required to talk to people about the potentially fatal risk of police involvement, the risk of traumatization related to the crisis continuum of care, whether it's forced restraint, involuntary holds, things of that nature. And so over the past couple of months have been trying my best to get that bill entered. I'm sort of at close to the end of phase one, where I have a little bit more time to try to secure a sponsor for the bill in California. And I'm actively and avidly trying to do that. And so hopefully that will happen in the next week or so, and then the bill will proceed. And if not, we'll try again for the next cycle in the fall of 2025.
Amazing. Yeah. I mean, it's incredible to me that healthcare providers are not only trained on this, but they're not required to really like give informed consent about the dangers of coercion, coercive treatment, forced restraint, all of these things. And it's also wild to me that with the exception of maybe a few small towns in the United States that have been really radical in their police reform, that police are also not required to be trained on any mental health conditions. I know a few areas, like I think Burlington, Vermont, has had peer support workers act in conjunction with the police force to be the first responders. Very different when you have a peer specialist going out and talking to someone who's having a mental health crisis than a police officer, right? But the fact that these things don't regularly happen is baffling, and it leads to a lot of violence and death, as you said. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I think for me, it was, in 2020, amidst our country's latest racial reckoning and interacting with people who are in crisis and then, what was happening in our country's streets, the idea of sending people into emergency room settings and not explaining to them the risk of experiencing all the established inequities that have been researched for years. And I think for me, my instinct with my oath was like, how do I do all the things to protect people while they get crisis care? And, sometimes I would literally walk people over to the emergency room, and I would have a colleague that I trusted who would pick them up and then, that person I knew would not restrain or inject or keep them there unnecessarily or kick them out of the facility. So there were just so many backflips that I had to try to do to try to make the crisis care actually caring, that at some point I was like, wait, if I have to work this hard to do this, maybe I should really question whether or not it's the right thing to do, or at the very least have conversations with people, telling them the full truth of what could happen as part of a responsible, informed consent process.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if the Shield Act gets passed, how would that be integrated into services?
Yeah, so it would require certain healthcare providers to do a brief training, approximately 90 minutes long, looking at these things. And so the bill outlines some of the components of this training, like what it means to look at various health inequities that shape the crisis continuum of care and to have strategies to push back against them. What it literally looks like to explain to people the potential risk of police involvement with 911, or even when 988 and mobile crisis are involved. They can be, deterrents from police involvements. They can also be conduits. So walking people through that, and then also explaining to people non-police alternatives, including some of the examples that you shared related to, having peer advocates, or looking at peer respite centers, or developing psychiatric advanced directives well in advance of a crisis so that a person has a say in a plan for things. So those are some of the big concepts that the training would cover, which are precisely the concepts that I did not experience during my own training or ongoing professionalization.
Yeah, absolutely. Beautiful. And if people want to get involved or support, how can they do that at this point?
Yeah, I would say two big things. There's a petition on change.org. It's change.org forward act shield act, or sorry, change.org / shield act campaign, all one word. And folks can also go to my website, www.rupileghamd.com. I have a bunch of different links, including one to the Shield Act, and you can learn more about it there.
That's awesome. And I know that you've also been focusing on training other healthcare providers and anyone who's interested in anti-racist training through your fellowship program. So I'd love to hear you talk more about that.
Yes, yes. So I put together the Antiracism and Mental Health Fellowship in towards the end of 2023. And, at that time, I had my practice up and running for a couple of years. And then I had also, written a bunch of different papers, and, there were some clear themes that were starting to come out. And so a guide and coach said to me, really your next step is to create a training program. And, my experience being invited to speak at healthcare settings, academic medical centers, it's like people are up for an hour or 2 hours and like kind of a one-off lunch talk that leaves them with some, nice bullet points, but nothing really sustained or transformative. So the fellowship is kind of like the anti-lunchtime talk. It's 30 lectures, 5 modules, a 4-month program that includes, discussions about the material. And then, each of the lectures generally has like an assigned reading for it, a journal reflection prompt. And, one of the big critiques that comes up around anti-oppression teaching in healthcare is that it doesn't position people to really do things differently. There might be some theoretical considerations. So for each of the lectures, I have like anti-racism practices related to documentation, psychoeducation, and clinical activism. So people walk away with, at least like 75 different strategies about things that they can do the minute they walk out the door in their clinical practice. So yeah, they launched in 2024 with a really amazing cohort, and and continuing to pilot it and trying to bring people in who are looking for something different. I think the imperative for it has shifted even in the past couple of weeks, given where we're at with DEI and health equity. initiative. So I think as it becomes harder to access some of this material in federally funded institutions, there may be a greater need for people to seek out this kind of information and training and community on their own.
Absolutely. That sounds like an incredible resource that you've developed. And also just the ability for people to see I'm not alone in some of the things that I've been thinking and experiencing, my critiques. Yeah.
That's right.
Amazing. Great. Well, is there anything else that you would like folks to know about your work or about anti-racist psychiatry?
Yeah, I'm so grateful for y'all's existence. And I think for me it's been huge to see your organization's work and commitment to training and just like you said, knowing that there are other people out there. And yeah, I think there's some really profound shared values around what we're all trying to achieve. And then there's some lovely diversity of strategies and approaches for doing that, all of which is valuable and important. So thank you so much for existing, for creating the space, and for inviting me to be here.
Thank you so much. And I'll have the links to all of your work down in the description so folks can check it out. And thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.